Café Scientifique is a monthly series of expert-led discussions on science and culture presented by the Bell Museum of Natural History. For more information about the Bell Museum, or to find out about upcoming Café Scientifique programs, visit bellmuseum.org or find us on Facebook and Twitter.
Good evening and welcome to Café Scientifique. Woo! All right! Hey, this is a very special evening for a bunch of reasons. One is I am now a volunteer here for the Bell Museum. I retired this spring. Yay! All right! And the other is my grandson, who is, I think, probably the youngest audience member ever to show up at the Bell Museum. His name is Marv. He is right over there standing with my daughter. That my grandson is not my daughter's child, however. The guy that procreated Marv is standing in the back there. That's Jesse. And that other one standing there, sorry, Sarah, is Sarah, my daughter. Yay, all right, all right. I'm going to turn it over to Leah now.
All right. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much, Kevin. We are really, really thrilled that you are here with us again this season. When he said he was retiring last spring, which is very exciting for you, I know that I immediately thought about Café, and not to mention that Kevin has been my professional mentor and the person who hired me at the Bell Museum. So I'm very excited to get to continue working with him here. Welcome. Thank you for coming on this gorgeous night. This is wonderful to see all these familiar faces. This might be the best turnout on a September cafe that we've ever had, at least since we've been here at the Bryant Lake Bowl, which, by the way, I was realizing was at least 5 or 6 years ago that we started here. This is the 13th year of Café. And as I was talking to Kevin and Kyle, our tech person, about getting ready for tonight, I also realized that we have done 43 cafes, the three of us together as a team, which I thought was pretty awesome, actually. So we'll be up over 50 after this season is over, which is great. And so without further ado, tonight, I have the curator of the Wangensteen Historical Library of Biology and Medicine, Lois Hendrickson, and the co-curator of the exhibit, also a PhD candidate in 16th century Italian domestic medicine, which is pretty exciting, Emily Beck, and they are going to share with us the bodies and spirits, health and the history of fermentation and distillation. So thank you very much. Come on up.
Okay, so I'm just curious, has anyone been to the Wangensteen Library before? No one. Okay, 1, 2, 3 people. Those are my family. That's why. But now you'll all have a reason to come. So, because you don't know, we can inform you, the Wangensteen Historical Library of Biology and Medicine has a collection of over 80,000 rare texts ranging from 1480 to 1930. We have particularly strong foci in anatomy, surgery, natural history, botany, alchemy. Every academic year, we plan an exhibit that connects the history of health, medicine, and science to themes we think our audience will find interesting. For this year, we settled on fermentation and distillation. We knew that Minnesotans were becoming increasingly interested in craft beer and slow food. After all, only 10 years ago, there were 5 craft breweries in Minnesota. This year, there are projected to be 111. The food culture of the city supports a huge number of farm-to-table restaurants, and farmers markets are everywhere. The do-it-yourself culture means that it's really easy to find a course on fermentation at markets, restaurants, through community education. So we knew that people would be really interested in fermentation and distillation. But we can't just put together an exhibit out of cool stuff. We can, but But because we're part of a major research institution and with our own educational goals, we really had to find ways to connect the history of science and medicine with these topics that resonate with the public. So how did we get to beer, wine, and distilled spirits from anatomy, surgery, botany, and alchemy? Especially in the Middle Ages and until the 19th century, food was very closely aligned with health. Many things that were prescribed by medical professionals often look to us today more like food than medicines. Many of the early books in the Wangensteen's collection highlight medicines that either use fermented and distilled drinks as bases for medicine or show how to make fermented and distilled products simply as medicines. It wasn't surprising to us then when we found that in 1612, Thomas Cogan said, "Ale or beer maketh gross humours, increaseth strength, and breedeth blood, provoketh urine, looseth the belly, and puffeth up, and cooleth moderately." Nutrition was such a part of health in this time period because the entire medical system was based on the theory of the four humors: blood, black bile, yellow bile, and phlegm. Yeah, it sounds gross. Each originating in different parts of the body, these humors had heat and moisture levels associated with them. So, for example, blood is hot and wet, phlegm is cold and wet. Each person has his or her own particular balance of heat and moisture. So illness and health were a direct result of whether or not a person's humors were in their correct balance. So, if hops were considered cold, beer that contained hops was a cooling agent, healthy for those who tended to be hotter. This theory was developed in ancient Greece and continued to be a driving medical theory for centuries. All medicines and many foods were organized by their agreed-upon degrees of heat and moisture. I think we can still see some traces of it today in phrases like hot-blooded. One of the first questions we decided to consider was production. How have people used the processes of fermentation and distillation and their resulting products over time in order to maintain health or deal with illness? How has fermentation and distillation been used to make pickles and deal with mad dogs? The first medical schools were established in Europe by the early 1200s, but physicians didn't become the average person's avenue to health care until much later. In addition to physicians, there were also barber surgeons, apothecaries, midwives, wandering experts, and charlatans, all offering cures for whatever ailed you. But the majority of medicines were still made in people's homes. In order to keep track of all of these different medicines, most people kept notebooks of handwritten recipes. Just like culinary recipes today, these recipes were traded amongst friends and family and purchased from experts. The manuscript recipes in our collection reflect that. For example, in Mary Andrews' recipe book, written around 1680, she writes that her recipe for the gravel, i.e. bladder stones, come from a Mrs. Groswell. We see some evidence of purchased or expert recipes in the manuscripts in several ways. Sometimes the recipes come from particular people who are pretty sure the person didn't actually know, like the Queen of France. Sometimes we also come across newspaper clippings. So, for example, this manuscript features a printed advertisement about Adam's solvent for the stone and gravel. It says it was legally sold at a medical warehouse in London, and she stuck it next to a handwritten recipe for gooseberry wine. Although beer and wine could be purchased, many people just made them at home. Brewing and distilling were more of a homemaking skill than a professional field or art. Printed household manuals, like this one, always included recipes for fermenting, brewing, and distilling alongside things like Christmas menu recommendations and ideas of how much to pay your servants. Beer and winemaking did not move out of the home and into industrial production facilities until much later, around the same time as the Industrial Revolution. Even when they did, because these drinks were so closely aligned with medicine, people continued to make their own at home for their health care. So it's for this reason that we often encounter manuscript recipes like this one, a good cheap beer that you can make with any tubs or pails on the smallest scale for every poor family. It calls for half a bushel of malt, 5 ounces of hops, 12 gallons of water. And the recipe is actually pretty similar to what we see today in modern brewing instructions. Steep the malt, put the hops in later, boil it for a while, strain it, add the yeast. It says that the resulting beer will cost about 4 pence per gallon and that they got the recipe from Lincoln S. Mercury on 7 March 1795. Alcohol was considered healthy for a variety of reasons. In eras before clear understandings of microbial activity in spoilage and how to prevent it, fermentation and distillation were important methods for preserving foods and medicines. Water was widely mistrusted because it frequently made people sick. So just think about John Snow's mapping of the 1854 cholera outbreak in London. By pinpointing where each case was, which is, you can see the little black rectangles where people had cholera, he figured out that a particular water pump was the culprit. Everyone who had cholera was drinking out of this one water pump. Even though families making the cheap beer in the recipe didn't predict that boiling the liquid what was killing the bacteria or that there was bacteria and that was dangerous, they knew that the typical consumption of beer didn't make people sick. Plus, they had the bonus of nutritional value. The calories from the grains and food that were fermented to make these drinks were an important part of the early modern diet. So when the recipe says a good cheap beer for every family, the kids are included. Aside from drinking beer and wine for nutritional value and water safety, beer, wine, and distilled spirits were produced especially for medicinal purposes. A great example of this comes from a 1725 manuscript recipe book from the collection that features a recipe for the purging ale to be taken every spring and fall, from the middle thereof and from the middle of September to the middle of October. Purging was an important part of healthcare in the early modern period. Medicines that brought on visible results, such as causing blisters, proved to patients and physicians that those bad humors were coming out of the body, restoring balance and returning health. As a part of general health maintenance, purging helped to maintain balance when the seasons changed. A recent acquisition in the library has a recipe to cure a cough. In addition to 6 quarts of elderberries, 2 ounces of caraway seeds, 2 quarts of claret, it also calls for 2 ounces of alewives. We didn't know what that was. We looked it up. It's a Scottish name for a plant sometimes known as wild sunflower. I looked it up. WebMD says it's useful for lung diseases, including asthma, bronchitis, and whooping cough. It's also used to prevent coughing, especially coughing caused by tuberculosis. I don't know how well it works. I wouldn't just take it without asking someone. But it's interesting to see how a recipe from 1770 might have worked. So indeed, the author goes on to justify the choice of ingredients by saying the elderberries heal the liver, the alewives the lungs, the caraway seeds break the wind, the claret cuts the flame. Looking up the rest of the ingredients, we can see that a website called Annie's Remedy says that the caraway seeds help to deal with gas and bloating as well as coughs, breaking the wind. The University of Maryland Medical Center says that elderberries have for centuries been used to heal wounds and treat respiratory illness. In this case, the wine also has its own positive healing outcome of cutting the flame. Perhaps this means decreasing fever or simply cooling the body. However, it was also a carrier and a preservative for the healing benefits of the other ingredients. While we were planning this exhibit, it was always my dream to find someone who would try to make one of these recipes. But it's trickier than you might think. Authors of these recipes often wrote with the assumption that their readers would know more about cooking than we assume of our readers today. For example, you almost never see today a cake recipe that doesn't begin with preheat the oven to such and such degrees. This is obviously a result of having thermometers, but it's also the expectation that we don't each just know how hot the oven needs to be when you're baking a cake. This is the complete opposite of these historical recipes. Timing, temperature, exact measurements are frequently missing. So, for example, I once decided to make a potato pudding from one of the Wangensteen's recipe books.
That looks good.
It was good. Yeah, it was good. Some of the ingredients were really specific. A pound of potatoes, boiled, peeled, and finely pounded. Okay. Some are non-specific. Some nutmeg. I cook a fair amount. I kind of guessed. It was fine. After you mix everything together, it just says, bake it. How long? How hot? What is it supposed to look like when it's done? At the end of the day, this is actually a pretty straightforward recipe, even with the open end, which is why I chose it. Many of these recipes are much more difficult to reproduce. We have to account for differences in measurements, different kinds of ingredients, as well as different names for the ingredients. We also have to be aware of the inevitable changes in ingredients themselves. The average apple that you buy at the store today is just bigger than what you would get in the past because of genetic modification, either in a laboratory or just because of selection. But you'll be interested to know that we're currently working with a local restaurant on finding a few recipes to try out and present to the public. Pairing our historical knowledge with the expertise of professional chefs will take us in some interesting directions and hopefully result in something tasty. We'll keep the collaboration under wraps for the moment, but keep your eyes out for news of historical pickles.
Emily will make a guest return appearance later in the talk. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the science here. So although microbiology was still a mystery, the word fermentation existed as early as the 14th century, and it was associated with alchemy. It referred to a kind of digestive process involving putrefaction and then rebirth. By the 16th century, the word was associated with wine and beer production. So we've already established that beer and wine are fermented. So let's ask you, the audience, what other fermented foods and beverages can you think of? Just go ahead and shout it out.
Kimchi.
Kimchi. Sauerkraut.
Bread.
Bread.
Yogurt.
Yogurt. Soy sauce. Cheese. Pickles.
Namba.
I don't know namba.
It's
A Vietnamese food. Well, here's a list of some of the foods. Some of them you recognize, some of them you talked about.
Fermentation is all around us.
Yes, it's all around us, Emily is saying. Chocolate, that was a surprise. Yep. So fermentation, as you can see from the list, is an international food and beverage process essential to all cultures. Because of the kinds of materials we have in our collection, our focus in this exhibit has been on beer, wine, and pickles and chocolate. So why is part of our exhibit called The Romance of the Holes in Bread? Someone shouted out bread. So even though we started researching this exhibit with over 200 books from the Wangensteen's collection, some books just invariably stand out. We try to be judicious in which books we pick for display, but some titles are eye-catching, silly, and they just stick out. Emily's ongoing favorite is On Fish Eating and Leprosy, a statement of facts and explanations. Thankfully, this book, The Romance of Holes in Bread, in spite of its funny title, was actually relevant to the exhibit. It was written by a man named I.K. Russell and published in 1924, and it's an example of the influence of fermentation on human life and the influence of Louis Pasteur's research on fermentation on the scientific and culinary community. So in his first chapter, Russell introduces these ideas. He writes about the lack of understanding for fermentation and yeast. He talks about a farm publication and a writer resentfully writing against the way a farmer's wheat is turned into bread. The farmer didn't get enough of the money. He says, the farmer's wheat is solid and whole, he repined, but the consumer's bread is full of holes. He pays for wind as much for solid food. And that's just it. If this young man had only known of the tremendous debt that civilization owes to the holes in bread, he'd not be writing thus disrespectfully. And as it happens, the writer goes on to say, the greatest romance of the modern world centers upon the holes in bread. You might say the modern world exists in much that separates it from the ancient world upon an incident that occurred during the study of what causes holes in bread. Russell continues in this vein, writing about Louis Pasteur. Some of you may know Pasteur, but for those of us that haven't thought about him for a while, he was a French chemist and microbiologist living and working from 1822 to 1895. He's remembered for breakthroughs in rabies and anthrax vaccination, hence the title of our exhibit, if you remember at the beginning, Pickles and Mad Dogs, disease prevention, and especially for discovering principles of microbial fermentation and pasteurization. So previously, the short time between milk production and consumption sort of minimized the disease risk. However, with industrialization and the burgeoning urban growth, fewer people kept dairy cows. So this farm-to-table time increased, and this day-old raw milk that was being sold was a dangerous source of disease. Food preservations at the beginning of the 19th century involved heating the food to an unnecessarily high temperature for a very long time. So in 1864, Pasteur developed a new food preservation method, inspired in part by a summer holiday and the acidity of local wine. Because who hasn't been inspired by summer holidays and wine, right? His experiment revealed that heating the wine to 120 to 140 degrees Fahrenheit for a brief time killed microbes, and the wine could be finished without sacrificing quality. And this process became known as pasteurization. You may occasionally think of Louis Pasteur when you're reading a milk label that says pasteurized and homogenized. So a few years later, in 1876, Pasteur writes Études sur la bière. Excuse my French, right? Studies on fermentation, the diseases of beer, their causes, and the means of preventing them. He published in here methods for fermenting beer without contaminating it with other microbes, which Pasteur claimed were responsible for spoilage. So although people had been brewing and drinking beer for centuries, Pasteur brought the first scientific understanding of the process of fermentation. He had concrete evidence of living microbes and discovered that tiny living bacteria were to blame for the spoilage of beer and wine. Now, we might take this understanding for granted, but this was a huge leap forward in scientific understanding, and it really changed the course of beer making and propelled the industry of beer making into the modern era. He has some chapters in his studies on fermentation that might seem relevant to the DIYers in the crowd, your home brewers. He says in one chapter, heading, every unhealthy change in the quality of beer coincides with the development of microscopic germs which are alien to the pure ferment of beer. He also says in a chapter, heading, yeast may become dry and be reduced to dust without losing its faculty of reproduction. Louis Pasteur also drew some of what he saw under the microscope, and here's an example from this book that we brought with. And if you're interested in his scientific methods, some of you science methods people, here's how he tested his theory. He conducted a series of experiments. He took a few bottles of sound beer, placed some of these bottles in a hot water bath, and raised the temperature to about 140 degrees Fahrenheit. Next, he let them cool, and he placed them by the side of other bottles that were not heated. In every case, especially in the summer, in a few weeks, and the length of time varied according to the temperature and quality of the beer, all of the bottles which had not been heated became diseased, in some extents even to being undrinkable. So we started this exhibit, as I said, with several hundred potential books. How did we cull it down to the 67 that are in our exhibit? Well, lots of research and lots of talking with people. We had conversations with our colleagues and with the public, and they have been major factors in determining the exhibit's direction and determining which books, like The Romance of Holes in Bread, survived the final cut. And as Leah said, we went to social science, the fermentation. Here is our table at social science. So here's what we're thinking early in the fall, early in the spring, in February, March. We knew that Pasteur and his research should feature in the exhibit somehow, but it really wasn't until we attended the Science Museum's social science event that we were sure exhibit visitors would actually be interested in Louis Pasteur. Some of you maybe have been to social science. You know that typically it draws a couple thousand people. But fermentation night, okay, that's a big deal. Everyone knows there's going to be local craft breweries with free samples. We knew we'd be little fish in the big pond. And we knew that in order to make ourselves stand out at this huge event, we need to bring some artifacts and rare books for people to look at. So we brought, as we did tonight, the first edition of one of Pasteur's books to show you the drawings that he made of what he saw under the microscope, and people were captivated. People thought a first edition was cool, but they were really interested in the drawings, which represented the first time that this biological process, as we understand it, was made clear to scientists. So Pasteur maintained his place in our exhibit plan, and he introduces the section of the exhibit dedicated to fermentation. So come up and see it afterwards. Our colleagues were also a great source of ideas and information. One of our colleagues formerly worked for Seagram's and had a private collection of historical texts and a plethora of knowledge about distillery processes and production. He constructed this scaled model of a 1930s coffee still that is the first thing you would see if you came to our exhibit. And a coffee still is a 2-column continuous still, which allows a greater portion of the vapors to recirculate into the still instead of flowing into the receiver with the spirit. We also received help from our friends and an assist from social media. We discovered this great image along with a poem in French, but neither Emily nor I read French. Emily showed it to her friends and then posted it on Facebook to see if anyone was willing and able to translate it. After a lot of good-natured back and forth on Facebook, a translation was done by Vladimir Gitzak, husband of our outreach specialist, Bonnie Gitzak. Bacchus beloved, of pleasant domain, only the wretched from your company refrain, and the delectable joys your presence sustains. 1750. And I should mention that with the exception of 1 or 2 photos, all of the things you're seeing on the slides today are from things in our collection, and most of them from what is in the exhibit. So even our associates in the antiquarian book trade offered their expertise. They recommended bibliographies to help us discover obscure books about fermentation and distillation. So from my point of view, reading these annotated lists of books was really fascinating, and discovering many of the books already on our shelves was really akin to uncovering treasure. This exhibit offered us a chance to showcase 3 recent purchases: a book on beer, a perfume advertisement, which you see here, and a manuscript recipe book. In addition to Pasteur, we also brought an early 20th century pharmaceutical box to the Science Museum event. These boxes, which were assembled by early pharmacy students at the university, were used to help students identify and keep track of all the medicinal plants that were used in pharmaceutical compounding. Each student would have to do a series of these boxes before graduating. And we have several of them in our collection at the Wangensteen Library. Interestingly, many of the plants in these boxes are frequently found in fermented and distilled beverages today. And we have the box that we brought to the Science Museum that you see pictured here with us today, so come up and see that as well. Because of the popularity of this pharmaceutical box, we knew we wanted part of the exhibit to focus on the kinds of plants that are used in fermentation and distillation. And although we could have gone any number of directions, for example, talking about rosemary or lavender, we decided to focus on hops in the section devoted to beer. A major reason for this was the number of people who said, "Oh, I have hops in my backyard. Do you want some for the exhibit?" Or asked us, "Do you know the history of India pale ales?" So as it turns out, hops is a perfect opportunity to introduce one of the most significant aspects of alcohol in medicine. That is, medicinal qualities of plant material can be transferred to new media, enhanced, and made to last a very long time if steeped or distilled into alcohol. So what about the history of pale ales? So pale ales were developed in mid-19th century Great Britain because Englishmen needed beer that could travel over long distances without spoiling. Travelers that went to warmer climates wanted a beer with a relatively low alcohol content. And today the popularity of IPAs has again grown. In 2015, Business Insider said, "The IPA is without a doubt craft beer's most popular style." They assert that America's taste buds are becoming increasingly accustomed to bitter flavors, so the increasingly bitter IPAs of the craft movement are very popular. This is a historic image of hops from our collection. So how is this all connected to medicine? As one of our authors from one of our books, George Overend Dewey, said in 1876, the success of hoppy IPAs was, quote, everywhere apparent as contrasted with the stronger and more alcoholic beers sent out previously. They were seen to have greater virtues than other beer, perhaps because the bitterness of the hops was seen as having a tonic effect. Even though IPAs themselves haven't been actually around that long, the medicinal use of hops has been well known for many centuries. For example, in 1612, Thomas Cogan, who we heard from before, said, seeing for the most part that there is felt no small bitterness in beer, there is no doubt that all beer is hot, and how much more bitter it is, the hotter it is. Notwithstanding, I think that hops in beer make it colder in operation because, as I said before, it purges color. So as Emily was explaining, the diagram of hot and cold, that's how they're thinking about hops. A few years later, her colleague Nicholas Culpeper published the English Physician, a reference guide to medicinal ingredients. Culpeper offers a description of hops, talks about where it grows, when is the best time to pick it, and all of the plant's medicinal virtues, such as it opens obstructions in the liver and spleen, cleanses the blood, helps to get rid of ringworm and sores. And he finishes by saying, by all these testimonies, beer, which contains hops, appears to be better than ale. In our collection, we also have this 1855 compendium of patient records from a doctor at the University of New York. He notes that he made a poultice of hops and laudanum to cure eye pain and inflammation. Indeed, even in this 20th century box of hops in our collection, which was sold to pharmacists for use in compounding medicines, hops are identified as being an aromatic bitter, useful in dyspepsia. It's also useful as a sedative, useful in nervousness, hysteria, and insomnia. So although Dewey was skeptical that there was any relationship between the bitter herb and health, when thin, bitter ales were brought back to England from India, they were seen as a kind of panacea or a cure-all for want of appetite, loss of digestive power, and many other deranged conditions. So as we continued researching and talking to these people, we realized we were really fortunate to be in Minnesota and be at the university because of all its agricultural science related to brewing. We talked, for example, to Fulton's head brewer, and he mentioned that the upper Midwest was once a huge hop growing region, but that they had not been grown commercially since the hop craze in Wisconsin in the 1860s and 70s. And in addition to changing tastes, Prohibition pretty much eliminated hops as a profitable crop for Midwestern farmers. In 2010, the University of Minnesota began collaborating with various groups and individuals to study hop production, processing, and diseases. Minnesota farmers began growing diverse hops crops, and initially beginning with research that would cater to large national brewers, but since have shifted its research focus to varietals, especially favored by craft brewers.
We've so far spent a lot of time on fermentation, but distillation was perhaps even more significant to healthcare across all of these time periods. In the 16th century and earlier, distilling was considered alchemical. Although today alchemy makes people think of the philosopher's stone and making gold out of base metals, its techniques were widely used to make medicines via distillation. By the 17th and 18th centuries, distillation and other parts of alchemy were accepted as significant parts of science and medicine. Basically, distillation is a process of separating components from a liquid mixture by selective evaporation and condensation. So in eras when the most significant medicines were derived from the virtues of plants, distillation was a powerful way to make more and more potent cures. A tea made from rosemary simply wasn't as powerful as essence of rosemary. Selecting books for the distillation cases was probably the most difficult part of the culling process. These books range from atlas-sized to pocket-sized, and many contain compelling schematics for a huge variety of distilling equipment, from furnaces to glassware, over a range of centuries. So, because we can only open each book to one page in the exhibit, we thought we'd treat you to some images hidden inside of them. So these are all images from the 16th century, and they show an emphasis on furnaces and alchemical activity within the context of pharmaceutical gardens and physicians treating patients. So you can see, especially in the colored image, we've got a guy in the corner who's got a whole lot of bottles behind him. They look sort of like these other distilling apparatuses up here. You've got some people working in a garden, got someone else over there treating a sick person. So in the 17th century, this image is from one of 40 books written by Johannes Glauber, who has been described as one of the first chemical engineers because of his improvements to chemical process and equipment. Part of his work also included studies on chemistry of wine production, and in this volume, medicine and the work on separation of metals. So this and the previous images were taken from large folio-sized volumes. In earlier centuries, when paper was extremely expensive and type needed to be set by hand, huge books like these would have been basically inaccessible for most people. This 18th century image is from a much smaller book, similar to what we have today. Cheaper to produce, cheaper to buy, and thus much more available to the average household. So, like brewing and winemaking, we know that a pretty big section of society would have undertaken at least some distilling activity. We can see here that distilling is not just for professionals. It's still a household activity that takes place in what's clearly a distilling room with women as producers. And I think that looks like a little kid in the corner stoking the fire. Family activity. In the early 19th century, this book, entitled Hall's Distiller, was published in Philadelphia and is advertised as being adapted to the use of farmers as well as distillers. It talks specifically about gin, whiskey, and brandy. This is an image of Anderson's patented condensing tub. When compared with earlier distilling equipment, both the image and the equipment itself look much more technical. By the late 19th century, we have stuff like this going on. This is from a book from the Schimmel Company. It was an essential oil company. This book presents their history and images of their production facilities. We can see that distilling has become very industrialized, both as it relates to alcohol and other things like cosmetics, essential oils, and perfumes. As we mentioned earlier, compounding medicines involved attempting to remove the potent parts of ingredients in order to apply them to the patient. Today, essential oils are generally used in perfumes to make us and our environment smell nicer, or in aromatherapy. In the past, scents were medicines. As you may have noticed today, plague is in the news again. Today, the Detroit Free Press reported that the first ever case of plague in Michigan was reported in the Upper Peninsula. Although there has not been a plague epidemic in the United States since the 1904 epidemic in San Francisco's Chinatown, bubonic plague is actually endemic in rodent populations on the West Coast, especially the Rocky Mountains. Every year, a few people in the U.S. contract plague while hiking or camping in these areas when they come into contact with infected rodents. In the early modern period, however, bubonic plague ran rampant. Today we know that this early plague was probably from the Yersinia pestis bacteria and was likely carried by fleas on black rats. Without this knowledge, however, early moderns worried that disease traveled through the air. In fact, the word malaria means mal, bad, aria, air, bad air. Public health efforts often included measures to clean the air by burning aromatics in public areas. You may already be familiar with this image. In order to protect themselves, 17th century plague doctors wore these huge beak-like masks in order to stuff the ends with aromatic plants like cloves and mint to protect themselves from the patients they were treating. Aside from plague, scents have been used to cure any number of illnesses. In one of our distilling manuals from 1633, A recipe for essential oil of nutmeg is meant to be taken internally instead of being smelled. It would drive down a woman's terms, so was dangerous for pregnant women, and when mixed with wine could take away head pains coming from cold. The book also says that oil of nutmeg makes good blood and expelleth phlegmatic and melancholy humors and makes a man merry. If used at night, it takes away all fancies and dreams. Even in 1770, when this perfume advertisement was published, and this is, again, a recent acquisition to the library, the perfume was said to cure heart palpitations, migraine headaches, toothaches, and heal burns. At the end of all of this, is alcohol, either fermented or distilled, healthy or not? We don't know. Neither do our books. Even though we've been focusing on the medicinal uses of alcohol in this talk, many of our books are very concerned about it. For example, in the early 1700s, London experienced the gin craze, a period of wild consumption of gin. So as the public drank itself silly, authorities worried about the fate of a nation whose people were incapacitated. The most famous caricature of the period are these two prints by English artist William Hogarth, Gin Lane and Beer Street, published in 1751. The prints compare mayhem-causing gin. You can see crumbling buildings, babies falling off of stairs. There's a guy on a pike back there. With Beer Street, which is much happier. There are healthy-looking people, there's building going on, there's some guys making a great painting. So in every time period, people argued about the values and dangers of different alcoholic preparations. In 1859 and 1887, we have examples in the exhibit of two books arguing the exact opposite point about alcohol in the diet of children. Earlier, we mentioned that beer was considered a food product, so children would have been imbibers along with their parents. Here, however, is an example of a disagreement. In 1859, the book Mothers and Infants made this recommendation to mothers about their children. I am strongly in the favor of wine in the diet of children. But in 1887, a book called The House I Live In told children that persons who drink any kind of alcoholic liquor regularly become diseased because such drinks do not make good blood as pure water and milk do. With young people, alcoholic drinks are especially bad because they tend to stop the growth. Although these debates continue even today, one major shift has occurred. Where in earlier centuries different alcohols were valued for their contents, attention has shifted to the presence of alcohol as a specific product. Scientific analysis of alcohol content in fermented and distilled beverages in the 19th century led some to believe that alcohol itself was a problem, regardless of the form it took. Quote, "The taste of different liquors may vary greatly, but they all produce certain physiological effects due to their common ingredient, alcohol." Unquote. Throughout the exhibit, we try to show how fermentation and distillation were employed by people throughout the centuries in an effort to make themselves healthier. In every century, there were debates about whether alcoholic products or alcohol itself would help or harm consumers. The major shifts we see from our books is that with advancing biological science, authors became more concerned with alcohol rather than what was in the alcohol. Beer could no longer stand as a health product simply because hops might help your nerves.
So as Leah mentioned, it's day 2 of our exhibit, opened yesterday. So we haven't really learned a lot yet about what our viewers and audience think of what we put together, but we're really looking forward to, having people come in and hearing what they think over the next year. The exhibit runs through May 31st, and if you'd like to see it, the Wangensteen Library is open from 8 to 4:30, Monday through Friday. So the library is located in the Biomed Library, which at the University of Minnesota is next to the hospital. And it's on the 5th floor. Because we are only open regular hours, 8 to 4:30, if you or one of your groups that you're involved with would like to come and see the exhibit, you can arrange with us ahead of time and we can figure out a time that will work for you and your group of friends or acquaintances or club to come and see the exhibit. We have a couple of upcoming events that are connected with the exhibit which are open to the public. And our other events will be announced and posted on our website. As Emily alluded to, we're working with some professional chefs, and so hopefully we'll be sharing what happens with regard to them making some of the recipes for fermented foods. So here's what's coming up. In December 7th, over the lunch hour, in the Biomedical Library right next to the Wangensteen Library, Dr. Christopher Boyce from the Department of Neurology and Medical Director of the Mayo Clinic Center for the History of Medicine will present a talk on Schuster Brewing Company, Rochester, Minnesota, medicinal tonic, temperance, and top brass. And this talk is open to the public. Later in the spring, so the spring of 2016, we're hosting a traveling exhibit from the National Library of Medicine. So the National Library of Medicine, the world's largest biomedical library, creates and lends traveling exhibits. We're hosting one called From DNA to Beer, Harnessing Nature in Medicine and Industry. This exhibit, also free and open to the public, highlights how scientists in partnership with industry developed techniques to harness powers of microorganisms, including early antibiotics, growth hormones, diphtheria antitoxins, and of course beer making, many things that need to be fermented. So in conclusion, we'd like to thank you for coming today and invite all of you and podcast listeners from the future to visit the Wangensteen Historical Library of Biology and Medicine at the University of Minnesota to see our exhibit, Bodies and Spirits, Health and the History of Fermentation and Distillation, open until May 31st, 2016. You can visit our homepage to see other events, z.umn.edu/bodiesandspirits, or on Twitter at #bodiesandspirits or #Wangensteen. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Emily and Lois. And we do have time for questions if people have questions. Right here.
This was really wonderful. I was hoping you could say a little bit more about kind of how the particular, maybe even in the exhibit or more generally about the topic, how it intersects with kind of global agricultural history. In particular, different ingredients traveling to different places. Not all of these ingredients were around in all of these places and all of these times. How did people look for or take or adapt new ingredients to new purposes for these in these contexts? And did people have ideas about how ingredients from certain places were maybe better for certain kinds of things?
I think we'll answer together. One of the major parts of our collection are herbals, which are often very large books that talk about different kinds of plants and what their uses are for. And so we see this sort of transfer of knowledge, which is kind of the history of science word for that, in those books. And I know Emily has spent a lot of time looking at them for her project.
Yeah, so good question. One of the examples of this in the exhibit is about cinchona. And this is a plant that's native to Peru, and it becomes extremely popular in Europe during the 16th, 17th, maybe even earlier centuries. They think that it's really great for like everything. We know today that it has quinine in it. So it's still, obviously it does something. We still use this. But we see it in terms of alcohol and moving into alcoholic preparations in bitters. So one of the base herbs for most bitters for a really long time is cinchona, and that's because it's distilling all of these really good plants into something very small that you can just take a little bit of. So yeah, that's one example of that. In terms of how do people figure out whether or not it's good for you when you haven't been exposed to it before, they're taking information from indigenous groups and fitting those plants into the existing system. So the pharmaceutical system doesn't really change a lot until the 20th century. It's a lot of just sort of stuffing other things into other places within the existing system. Thanks.
When did the science of pharmaceuticals diverge from the strict sense of the science of medicine or practicing medicine?
So, very early on, the medical hierarchy is established. So when we were talking about these early universities, there are medical schools there. The only people who are receiving university degrees are physicians. So pretty immediately, apothecaries who become pharmacists are separated from medicine. But physicians are still the ones in charge of prescribing exactly what the patient is getting, instead of today where you say you get to take Tylenol. They would say you get to take Syncona and mint. In terms of when pharmacy becomes something extremely specific like it is today, that is developed in universities, I don't know, do you know? The 1800s?
When you can distill?
Yeah, when you start distilling things more specifically and looking at chemical components and then synthesizing in laboratories. Yeah.
I'm curious if you could tell us how you came upon your focus for your PhD candidacy in 16th century Italian domestic medicine.
Like all good PhD theses, I found it in a footnote. So I had studied Italian in my undergrad, and I love cooking, and I saw this footnote about people taking down all of these notes about how they were treating people. And I'm really interested in social and cultural history, so what better way to access ground level than these recipe books? And they were really written by everyone. They're all over the place. I was in Italy for 3 months last fall, and every library I went to, even though the catalog would say, we have 3, they had 30. So they're fun to look at.
I think it's interesting, the history, at the University of Minnesota, the history of medicine, is it history of science, technology, and medicine?
Yeah.
Okay. As we've featured several cafes with people that have done their research in that area. And, you know, some of you may remember, so we've got tonight, history of fermentation and distillation. Our gentleman, Michel Janssen, who spoke about the history of Einstein. The true Einstein is also from, and he crosses over with astrophysics, of course. And then several years ago, Mark Borello, the biology of altruism. And so just a amazing, interesting, you know, all in very broad area of study.
We're all over the place.
All over the place. So, a question over here.
I'm curious when our program will evolve to aphrodisiacs and hallucinogens.
Thanks for the exhibit suggestion.
I know. That's an interest. You know, I wish Erin were here tonight. I'm just going to make a quick comment, and then I'll come right over here. And thank you for the cafe ideas, too, because I feel like that's doable. Maybe we can hit aphrodisiacs around Valentine's Day, February, you know. But Aaron Hoffmeister, who is hopefully going to rejoin us, he's been our volunteer for the past 4 or 5 years as an usher, so many of you would recognize him at the door. He couldn't make it tonight. He has worked for many years in the health and wellness department at the Seward Co-op. And one of the things that he, you know, has found really striking about his work there, he's a buyer now, so he's, you know, in charge of finding out what people want and procuring it. And in the Seward neighborhood, also where I live, there's a very strong population of East African immigrants and second, third generation families now. And people often come in looking for very specific herbs and plants and things that most of, you know, he doesn't run into for the rest of us, that they do carry specifically for that community that are along the lines of aphrodisiacs and fertility and certain things. And it's very, you know, so one of his most exciting adventures there has been tracking these things down and stocking them and finding them that for the cultural community that's there also. Oh, let me get this question up here.
Hi, I was just wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about the texts that are in the exhibit. You gave us a lot of examples of personal recipe books and things like that. Is it mostly this dichotomy of personal books and scientific books, or what should we expect?
Yeah, so there are a lot of these manuscript recipes, and to be honest, we talked about them a lot because I like them. It's not the majority of the exhibit. We have, the library itself is primarily printed books, and that can take any kind of form from the institutional to the personal sort of bathroom reader, random stuff. So in the exhibit, that's reflected too. So we've got some manuscripts. We have some very, very technical treatises. The Pasteur is pretty technical. Some of those distilling manuals are pretty technical. But again, because we have this range of size, we can tell that a lot of these things were produced for like everyday people. So we have some printed household manuals that were for everyone. Some of the distilling books are for anyone. So it's a pretty good range.
I know that homeopathic medicine, sometimes they use tinctures and distillates and, condensing. Did that fall over from beer distilling, or did that kind of spring up by itself, independent of the beer making process?
That's a good question. It all kind of goes together because, again, if you're interested in those plant materials and the things that are really good for you about them, you try to take them out in different ways. So, we're talking about fermenting them into something or putting them into fermented products or distilling them out of things. But it all goes together. So even though like the anti-grip whiskey just sort of looks like whiskey, you would still do the same kind of process even if you didn't call it whiskey, or if you were looking for a medicinal effect.
Let's give a big round of applause to Emily and Lois.